because I want to talk about, start off by talking about a woman who I think actually embodies the kind of feminist Alice is talking about, Carolyn Ware. This meeting of the AHA marks the 75th anniversary of a really important moment, a moment 3/4 of a century ago in 1940 when Carolyn Ware, who was a professional historian and also a New Deal activist, shook up this professional community. She was one of the first female professional historians. She was trained at Harvard, and she came to this meeting and helped to organize a whole series of panels. And the point of this sort of organizational effort was to point out something that we now all take for granted, but at the time came as a significant intervention, that no longer should historians be writing history of the elite, but instead of the masses, the inarticulate. What she called, which then soon became an edited collection of papers given on these various panels, the cultural approach to history. And what Ware meant at the time was that history should not simply just be, well, of course it should not be just the story of the elites, nor should it be just an accumulation of facts, as what she somewhat derisively called at the time a new history, that it was just sort of an accumulation of facts, but rather what she meant by the cultural approach to history was that it should be a total approach. There can be no illusion, she wrote in the introduction to this volume, that the experience of the individual constitutes a microcosm of the whole. The integration of the assembly line, the corporation, and most conspicuously of totalitarian nations engaged in totalitarian wars, forces an awareness of the total organization, total patterning, and the impossibility of appraising the significance of any part or aspect without relation to the whole. And this was sort of radical innovation when she made these proclamations. And as I mentioned, Ware was not only an intellectual and academic, but she was also an activist. There was really a symbiotic relationship between her intellectual work and her activist work. And this idea, this approach to history, that you should write a total history, mattered to her precisely because she was not only a historian, and a good one at that, but she was also a committed member of the American left. Her activism and her scholarship reinforced each other. She taught at Vassar, where she herself had been an undergraduate, and then also, in addition, she would teach female factory workers at Bryn Mawr Summer School for Industrial Workers. And she moved back and forth between the academy and government, committed as she was to crafting new public policies informed by her historical views, which would then organize at the grassroots and redistribute income to the masses. And this, both her intellectual inquiry and her activism, as I said, they reinforced each other. The pressing question for her, which began in her dissertation, which was about New England textile mills, which went on to win the Hart-Schaffner-Marx Prize, was the really animating question for her in every dimension of her life, really. Can political democracy survive in the face of what she saw as an industrial autocracy? So she writes in her dissertation, the class alignment, the idea of anyone quoting my dissertation seems horrifying, but here's what she said. The class alignment and the power of the capitalists brought new problems to the American democracy. Could political democracy encompass industrial autocracy? Could it harbor a working class and a money power and survive? These problems, she wrote, have confronted American communities as one by one they have experienced the process of industrialization. And Ware, I think, is a useful guide for us today in our conversation. because her set of intellectual interests, and more than that, her brand of activism, captures an important aspect of the history of the American left, which is the relationship between the grassroots and government. In her case, the New Deal government. The reciprocal relationship between organizing and state power. At Harvard, Ware studied with Frederick Jackson Turner, who is credited with coining the phrase history from the bottom up. What Ware was engaged in is what I call state building from the bottom up, and that's what I want to talk about today. And let me talk about two moments of economic catastrophe in the 20th century, the 1930s and the 1970s. And let me compare them briefly to see why they were so different. Why is it that the left had different impact in these 2 decades of devastation? Why, in short, one decade, the 30s, we see the country moving to the left, and in the 70s, we see the country moving to the right. There are many reasons for this shift, but let me just highlight the nature of state building in these 2 different moments. So let me start with the 1930s first, which I think is more familiar to everyone here, the iconic moment, really, that bound the left to the American government. So let's look briefly at the National Recovery Act and the National Labor Relations Act. And the basic idea, to me, that informed those on the left, at least, like every New Deal measure, they were the end result of a compromise among competing factions. But the American left, to someone like Carolyn Ware and her husband, the economist Gardner Means, what they saw as significant, and indeed they were leading architects of this aspect of the New Deal, was the insistence on redistributing income through passing laws, new public policies, that would then be implemented by organizing at the grassroots. What I call, for shorthand, state building from the bottom up. Carolyn Ware advocated for this kind of redistribution from her post on the National Recovery Administration's Consumer Advisory Board. And let me just stress this. And often people say, oh, you write about consumers. And I say, well, yes, I write about agencies that had names like the Consumer Advisory Board, but I want to be very specific about something. When people like Ware and Means and almost all of the New Dealers whom we would put squarely on the left talked about the consumer, they thought about something much broader. And in this sense, we have to think about sort of classical economic terms. You have the producer, and then you have the consumer, right? So in this model, the consumer is not just the housewife, who does her frivolous shopping. In this model, you have the producer, the money, business, economic interest, and then you have the consumer, which really meant something broader. The phrase at the time was the consuming public, or the consuming masses. And so this is how Ware and Means, who co-authored a book, The Modern Economy in Action, defined it. And also the problem, as they saw it, of the New Deal, of the Great Depression, the problem of maldistribution of income. To the producer-minded, the curtailment of production, the limitation of hours, and the lifting of prices can appear to be a satisfactory solution to the specific problem. So that is, the producer acts in his own self-interest, self-economic interest, to limit production, fire workers, and this is how he's going to maintain profits in a time of economic downturn. To the consumer-minded, they go on, the first question to be answered is, will the effect of the program be to make people able to eat more or live better? And it's that sort of total point of view of the consumer, right, as not the producer, that they really had in mind with these basic economic questions. And as I said, the basic idea of the public policies they supported in the New Deal was to redistribute income. And FDR, Franklin Roosevelt himself, reflected, spoke to, reinforced, underscored this idea. For example, when he said things like, the aim of this whole effort, by which he meant the New Deal, is to restore our rich domestic market by raising its vast consuming capacity. So when they think about redistribution, it's really at a pretty basic level. The idea to redistribute from profits to wages and to keep prices low so that they are affordable to the consuming masses. And so where does the organization at the grassroots come in? It was really quite significant to the conception, formulation, and really ultimately the implementation as they conceived it of New Deal measures, both through organizing labor and through organizing consumers. And the idea, basically, what later Galbraith, I think, would talk about countervailing forces, was to offset the power of business by organizing labor and consumers. The story, and the specific phrase, I don't think I've used it yet, was purchasing power. That was sort of the key intellectual, economic concept. Was fundamental to Keynesian economics, and what it meant in the hands of these policymakers, these activists, was the need to redistribute so that the public at large, the masses as they saw it, would have enough purchasing power to sustain and indeed grow the economy. So the story of organizing labor is well known. I don't really need to rehash it here. And the reciprocal relationship between really radical new pieces of legislation like the NLRA and grassroots organizing, that's a fairly familiar story too, retold in quotes like FDR wants you to organize, and the way that the CIO was able to sort of use these new statutory provisions as well as the endorsement from Franklin Roosevelt to motivate organizational campaigns. That's not, of course, to say that labor was not organizing before, but here I'm just highlighting this sort of reciprocal relationship. And the same was true on the consumer front. So the vision, the person who was head of the NRA Consumer Advisory Board that Ware worked for was a reformer named Frederick Howe. And he said that basically what his goal was to organize 100 million price skeptics. So that's kind of a radical idea. The idea that you as the consumer can challenge the ability of business to set the prices they want. And that's equally as powerful an idea as labor challenging the prerogative of the producer to set the terms of labor, to set the price of labor. How did that play out on the consumer front? Well, you have people like Tilly Kaplan in the Bronx, who took the charge seriously to form a consumer council of her fellow working class Bronx housewives, and she was going to lead a severe strike, she said, against the price of bread. And so when I went years ago to the archives, all of a sudden I looked in these boxes and there were hundreds of bread wrappers. And I thought, what are these? And what they are is, they're quite amazing. They don't exist anymore, but waxed paper bread wrappers, and underneath it would say 5 cents per loaf, and then wrapped on top of it was the new price, the inflated price, 8 cents, to pay for the processing fee as a result of the AAA processing tax. And Tilly Kaplan and others like her sent these bread wrappers in and said, okay, government, you do something about this. You go out and you get them. That was at least the idea. And what Ware called these, both the organizing at the workplace and organizing the consumers, she believed in a vision of organizing around what she called concrete daily economic experience. And this kind of vision, this committed to raising purchasing power by organizing at the grassroots, really reached its peak in World War II with the Office of Price Administration. So again, the story of labor is very familiar to us. And the same thing existed around consumers mobilizing. The critics saw the potency of 100 million price skeptics in World War II, what then became known as the kitchen Gestapo, and this idea that, and this is what happened. The OPA distributed these individual price lists to consumers across the country. And this is what you were supposed to pay, and you were not supposed to pay any more. And so you went to the butcher, and you said, this is what I'm paying for my meat, and I'm not paying any more. And each retailer had to have OPA official prices behind the counter so that everyone knew exactly what to pay and pay no more. And Ware codified and wrote about these ideas in a book she wrote, The Consumer Goes to War. So this is a kind of potent state building from the bottom up, where the stakes these reformers thought were quite high. Robert Lind, who Carolyn Ware worked with at the Consumer Advisory Board, said the only way democracy can survive, if indeed it is not too late for it to survive at all, is through the quality of living its rank and file of its citizens achieve. And that's what they really meant by the consumer vision. It wasn't what we think of as a consumer. It really was a radical vision of the need to redistribute income downwards. Now the story, and I'll go quickly through this part, of the 1970s was very, very different. And I'll highlight very quickly two programs where you see where you really see the absence of this kind of reciprocal relationship. So the first is the WIN campaign. I might be the first historian to take that campaign from the 40 years seriously. Oh, sorry. Sorry. You're going to have your turn soon. I will. With inflation now, that's what WIN stood for, and the idea basically was we'll give out buttons, and everyone will wear a button. And then, you know, the most horrible inflation that we've had in peacetime will disappear. It'll be great. The original idea was not to call it WIN, but to call it IF, inflation fighter, so everyone's supposed to walk around with buttons that said IF on it. You know, the problem is Ford put this into place very, very soon after he came into office, and his team was not really sort of up and running yet. And this was a bad idea. I wasn't going to say this, but it's a juicy quote. Dick Cheney, who became his eventually chief of staff, said it was Ford's Bay of Pigs. And soon the program died. The death was pretty clear when Ford's press secretary appeared at a press conference wearing an upside-down WIN pin, so it said N-I-M, which he then explained stood for No Immediate Miracles. And that was the death of that. So no grassroots organizing, no systematic effort. And in fact, the point of the WIN campaign was to resist the momentum and pressure coming from the Democratic Congress to perpetuate Nixon's wage and price controls. That was the point. This was supposed to be voluntary, non-state action. The second example, again, where you fail to see this kind of reciprocal relationship from public policies and the grassroots was, of course, with the energy crisis, which was the biggest economic calamity of that period and was quite visible to ordinary Americans, the way that bread prices would have been in the 30s, the way that meat prices were in World War II, and then, of course, in the 70s, the way that gas prices were. You know, you saw the price of gas going up in each corner store. And people were quite exercised about this, but the short story of the long book that I'm writing is the absence to effectively organize around these economic problems. You had Carter and other presidents from the period again and again appealing for voluntary sacrifice, carpools to drive slower, of course, the iconic cardigan sweater, which didn't start with Carter. It actually started with Melvin Laird in the Nixon administration. But the point was these were all meant to be sort of voluntary activities, not connected to specific public policies that were meant to organize and do something about these distributive questions. Russell Baker said that Carter's moral equivalent of war, which is what he called his energy program, which Baker pointed out, the acronym was MEOW, was worse than his bark. There are many reasons, of course, and I'm not here to go into them, just to observe the differences between the 30s and 70s, and there are many reasons why these two periods were so different. You could read Judith Stein's excellent book on the devolution of union power, for example, combined with Jacob Hacker's work on the risk shift, highlighting how things like the earned income tax credit and 401ks instead of pensions shifted the burden from the public onto individual families. So there are many reasons for this shift in political economy. I just wanted to point out that what you have in the 1970s is the failure to have an expansion of governmental power linked with organizing at the grassroots. The environmental movement was a significant exception, and I'm just going to say one sentence, which maybe you'll then attack me for. And it was very successful, the environmental movement, at integrating policy and activism, but it was not connected to distributive questions. So, I'll conclude. Recently, Chuck Schumer, I'm sure you've noted this, said it was too bad, this is a paraphrase, that Obama focused on the Affordable Care Act at the expense of fundamental economic questions like wages, jobs, benefits for people who vote. This point of view, he got a lot of flack for it, but there might have been something to it. However, there was a moment when the Affordable Care Act had this potential to organize, at least according to the person all the way down there, Nelson, who wrote an op-ed after we chatted about it, so I was implicated in it too. Nelson wrote, if it's done right, the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, may well promise uninsured Americans a lot more than cheap, reliable medical care. It can also open the door to democratic empowerment of millions of poor people who are often alienated from much of the nation's civic life by strengthening the organizations that give them a voice. That's what Nelson said, and Nelson's vision was you were going to have these navigators, right? And they were going to be like the kitchen Gestapo, and they were going to organize like Tilly Kaplan at the grassroots to build the state from the bottom up. As the poor, alienated, and fearful realize that tangible benefits can be won through their neighborhood clinic, civic group, or local trade union, and are drawn into civic life and grassroots actions, these organizations that are essential to the health reform's implementation will be strengthened as agents of civic engagement and civic mobilization. Right on, but still, soon after, Nelson wrote a follow-up article saying, well, it didn't work out that way, exactly, and focused much more on the obstructionist tactics that, in addition to fighting for repeal and court challenges, circumscribed these navigators. In any case, it underscores Nelson's hope, underscores what is in fact missing today, Tugwell, I'll just quote him, Rexford Tugwell, another one of these left New Dealers, said, when we have public policies, we need to empower and embolden and implement them by grassroots organizing. Otherwise, he said, it's like a spearhead without a shaft. So as we talk about the left, we certainly need to talk about movements, ideas, But we also have to talk about the relationship between the left and the state.